A prince sat outside in the courtyard of his castle, holding a sword in his hand. The prince examined the sword with awe. Smiling, the prince stood up and swung the sword, causing it to make a swishing noise. Grinning with satisfaction, he took the sword and slid it into his sword sheath to hold it to his side. Walking over to the horse stable on the edge of the woods, he pulled open the stable door and pulled out his horse, walking beside his horse, holding onto the reins until he reached a dirt trail. Swinging his leg over the back of the horse, he sat on the saddle and snapped the reins, making the horse go into a steady trot. He gently kicked the horse's sides, causing him to go from a trot into a gallop down the road. The prince's shaggy brown hair blew in the wind, hitting him gently on the face. The prince let out a yell of excitement as he forced his horse to go faster. A waterfall came into view from the side of the dirt trail right outside of the woods. A path of sand and pressed down grass led to a long bridge that hung over a steady river. Riding his horse off the trail, he slowed his horse down to a walk and crossed over the river. Trotting down the side of the mountain to the riverside, he jumped off the horse. The prince pet his horse's nose and walked off to his hut in the woods. A small square hut sat in the middle of a dirt patch next to the riverside. Large boulders surrounded the hut, along with tree branches from the storm the night before. It looked like a mess. A green snake hung down from one of the trees. The prince smiled and laughed as he swung the sword at tall grass that grew down the side of the river. The river moved slowly from the waterfall past the dirt patch with the trees, through the forest and into the river. Kneeling down at the edge of the river bank, the little prince swung his sword at a patch of grass, causing a large alligator to come out of the grass and lay in front of him. The alligator opened his mouth wide and let out a loud hiss, causing the prince to raise his sword in the air in defense. Giving full swings, he yelled at the alligator to leave and threatened it with his sword. The alligator hissed again and walked off into the river. Proud of himself, the prince smiled and let out a laugh. Aha! Moments later, he heard leaves rustling on the other side of the river. The prince put his finger to his mouth and turned to his horse as if he were telling it to be quiet. Turning back, the prince crept slowly alongside the river until he came up to a rock trail. The prince walked slowly and balanced on each rock, being sure not to fall into the water. Once the prince got to the other side, he moved behind a bush and knelt down, holding his sword out in front of him. The rustling noise came closer and closer. Once it was close enough, he looked around the bush to see a large dragon looking for smaller animals. Taking a deep breath, the prince yelled and jumped out from behind the bush, swinging his sword, scaring the dragon off into the sky. The prince laughed as he watched the dragon fly off. I sure showed him, the prince said as he looked over to his horse. Walking back over the trail of rocks, the prince walked into his hut. Sitting on a chair, he put the sword down next to him. A stack of rocks formed a fireplace. The prince put his hands out in front of him, warming his hands from the fire. The sky eventually started to get dark, which made the prince get up from his seat. Walking out of his hut and away from the woods over to his horse, he pet the horse and grabbed his reins tightly. He walked up the trail off the side of the mountain until he reached the bridge, crossing over slowly with his horse close to his side. Once he reached the other side of the river, he walked his horse up the dirt path onto the dirt road. Swinging his leg over the horse's back, he sat down on the saddle, grabbed the reins firmly, and snapped them with a loud crack. Galloping back up the road to his castle, he smiled to himself with satisfaction of his day. Coming up to his castle, he rode his horse off the dirt road and over to the horse stable. Opening the door of the stable, he placed his horse inside. Closing the door, he held onto his sword and walked into his castle. Okay, now that was part 2. And now I will explain the story if anybody didn't catch on. The first part of this story is what it would look like if an adult was watching a child play, using their imagination, and they just see normal stuff. And then part 2 is how the boy sees it with his imagination. So yeah, that's pretty much the explanation of the story. But I hope you guys liked it, and sorry I haven't made a lot of videos, and I will talk to you guys later.